Here are 10 mechanical tips every four-wheel driver needs to know so you can diagnose common issues your vehicle has and figure out what causes the damage.
We reckon there's essentially three main things that can damage your four-wheel drive. Driving over rough corrugated roads when you're really heavily loaded, lack of maintenance to your four-wheel drive, and also consistent hard driving off-road, particularly on tougher tracks.
When you modify a four-wheel drive with bigger tyres and suspension and drive it hard off-road, it's going to wear out a lot faster in areas like the driveline compared to when it was stock. In this video, we're going to show you the most common parts of your four-wheel drive that will wear and fail, how to diagnose problems before they arise, and tips on maintaining and fixing the problem in the first place.
Having a worn out tail shaft can be one of the most annoying things to deal with when you're driving, because a worn out tail shaft will cause driveline vibrations, which can get very frustrating.
Bad tail shafts can be caused by hitting them on rocks or logs out on the tracks, or uni joints failing, which can happen after a long service life, or if you're driving in lots of watery and dusty conditions, as both of these can make their way into the uni joint, which contaminates the grease, causing excessive heat, which eventually leads to failure.
As well as that, having larger tyres and some tough off-road driving puts a lot of stress on your poor old uni joints, particularly a lot of that stop-start off-road driving and excessive wheel speed. Fortunately though, tail shaft issues are one of the easier things to diagnose.
With the vehicle in neutral and safely secured with wheel chocks so it won't go anywhere, inspect the shaft for any dents or gouges, as these will affect the balancing of the shaft and cause vibrations. Next up, give each end of the tail shaft a shake like this to check the unis. Worn out unis will move excessively and will need to be replaced to avoid failure.
Having said that, it is worth noting that once a uni joint does start to get a little bit of play in it, it's worth changing it out.
Do the same thing with the slip joint too by giving it a shake as well. It's also a smart idea to check over your front and rear tail shafts every service or around 10,000 Ks or so, and re-grease if required. Also ensure you inspect them when you get home from a trip if you've done a lot of river crossings, long dusty drives, or some mud bogging too.
Braking an axle or a constant velocity or CV joint can be pretty difficult to diagnose, particularly in a solid axle vehicle, unless you're watching the vehicle drive off-road and you hear a loud bang followed by a loss of drive to a particular wheel. Oh!
If the CVs are worn on your vehicle, one way to check is to turn at full lock with the vehicle in four-wheel drive. If you hear a clicking sound coming from the front end, your CVs are worn. Axles usually fail from aggressive driving style, larger tyres causing excess stress on the driveline, and years of use causing fatigue and wear, followed by shock loading. For example, if you're out four-wheel driving and a wheel's spinning in the air and quickly comes back into contact with the ground, that shock load often causes a CV to fail, but particularly one that's had a long life. With IFS CVs, it's way easier to tell if you've blown a CV, as there will be grease and ball bearings all over the track.
Differentials are one of the more expensive areas to maintain if they do fail, and they need to be set up properly by a reputable diff specialist who knows what they're doing if you want them to last a long time. Excess wear in your diffs can usually be narrowed down by listening out for clunking or whining, particularly as you drive and you're on and off the accelerator, also at higher speeds on the freeway as well. If you do hear something like that, the next best course of action is to drain your diff oil.
The colour of the oil will tell you everything you need to know. If it's milky, it can indicate water has contaminated the oil. If it's dark grey, it can mean your diff oil hasn't been changed in a while or the diff is wearing out. But if there's large chunks of metal in your diff, it's a pretty safe bet to diagnose that you've got some chipped teeth off the crown wheel or the pinion. Another way to check for wear in your diff is to have the opposite end of the diff you're checking's wheels chocked so the vehicle can't move and it's in neutral. With your hand, try and lightly rotate the tail shaft in both directions. If there's a bit of movement and you can hear some clunking internally, that's usually a good sign that there's excess backlash in your diff and it will need a rebuild at some point.
Wheel bearings have a pretty hard life. They get up to extremely high temperatures, particularly if you're driving around with big tyres or you're doing lots of Ks.
Common causes for failure are things such as water ingress, lack of maintenance, larger tyres and larger offset wheels, as well as bearings coming loose over time. All this creates more heat, which reduces the service life of the grease inside your hub, which in turn reduces the service life of your wheel bearings. The reason people fit larger offset wheels is because it allows you to fit larger tyres as the tyre isn't sitting in the guard as much. It gives you a wider stance for a bit more stability off-road, and it also makes the vehicle look tougher as well. But fitting a larger offset wheel and larger tyres puts a lot more stress on your bearings.
From your factory, your wheels are bolted nice and close to your wheel bearings, essentially like that. As you can see, there's not much leverage on the bearings, but if you add a greater offset wheel, you're essentially moving it further away from the bearings, which creates more leverage. Add to that a bigger tyre and there's much more force on the bearings, which wears them down faster.
Regular inspections and repacking is the best way to keep on top of your bearings. The easiest way to check is to jack your vehicle up, secure it on axle stands, and put your hands at 12 and 6 on the tyre. Rock the tyre and wheel back and forward, and if there's any movement, your bearings need inspection, repacking or tightening.
Wearing down suspension bushes like this one usually happens from a long service life. But running bigger tyres, a bigger lift, or getting more travel out of your suspension, or just running the wrong type of bush for the particular suspension setup you have can make these wear down much faster.
A worn bush can often be diagnosed by clunking or movement in the driveline. Another way to tell is to see if a vehicle moves around on the road under acceleration or deceleration.
If you have to fight to keep the vehicle in a straight line, it's usually a sign that you may have worn suspension bushes.
Heading under the vehicle, get yourself a pry bar and work your way around all the areas in your four-wheel drive that use a bush setup. Lever the pry bar in and try and get a bit of movement out of the arm. If you can move it, it's a sign the bush is worn and needs replacing.
Just thought I'd explain what I meant about increased lifts wearing down your suspension bushes faster. Imagine that this screwdriver is a trailing arm. From factory, it sits nice and flat and the bushes are nice and happy. It can move through its range of motion relatively freely. When you lift your vehicle, you change the angle of that arm. And what that does is it creates much more leverage on the bushes in the arm. In fact, when you hit bumps, that force is then increased and it wears down your bushes faster. It's a pretty basic idea, but that's more for coil and link suspension. With leaf springs, for example, in the back of dual cab utes, the idea is very similar, but if you add a heavier leaf pack, there's much less give in the suspension, which means that force when you hit bumps goes through the springs and wears out your bushes faster. Particularly if you do have a heavy leaf pack on the back of your vehicle, but you're not carrying a lot of weight, because they'll be much stiffer.
Another trick is to get a mate to crouch down and watch the vehicle as you drive forward and back. They can see if any arms move as you stop, and also listen out for clunking noises as well.
If your vehicle has a panhard rod, which is this bar here, its job is to control side-to-side movement of your diff on a solid axle vehicle. If the bushes are worn down in this end or that end, you'll get a lot of steering wobble.
Worn panhard bushes are often caused by extreme angles on the arm from large suspension lifts and wear and tear on higher kilometre four-wheel drives. The easiest way to diagnose it is to have a mate turn the steering wheel side to side as you watch both bush ends. If there's any movement at all, replace the panhard bushes.
With your steering arms, whether your vehicle's IFS or solid axle, the main thing you should keep an eye on are your tie rod or drag link ends. This one's one of my spares. It's an 80 series tie rod end, and basically it's a ball joint with a boot, and inside here is a bit of grease.
They're under a heck of a lot of stress, as each time you turn the wheel, these are what turn the steering knuckle.
And with big tyres like this, just imagine how much force is being transferred through to those tie rod ends and drag link ends every time you hit a bump.
If these boots are split, replace the ends. Remember on the $1,000 track with the Goodyear Ranger when we bent and busted the steering arm? This can happen easily in IFS four-wheel drives, and unless you have a spare on board, it can be a nightmare of a trackside fix.
A worn spring, like this one we pulled out of the Pony when we did the suspension install, will actually move through its range of motion easier because the metal in the spring has fatigue and the spring has become softer. That means that as you drive on rougher roads, your bump stops will hit the chassis more frequently, and over time that can cause fatigue in your chassis.
Also, worn suspension will lead to a much more uncomfortable ride when you're driving too. The easiest way to diagnose worn out suspension is to see how your vehicle is sitting.
Older leaf-sprung vehicles like the old Luxy will tend to lean over to one side as the suspension starts to sag and the spring flattens out. Fortunately though, with the Pony, because the suspension's new, she's sitting nice and level.
If your spring rates are incorrect for the load you're carrying, this can also speed up your springs wearing out as they physically weren't designed for what you want them to do.
When it comes to the shock absorbers in your vehicle, they can massively impact how your vehicle drives and its performance. The biggest killer of a shock is overheating, and that can usually happen from driving on rough, corrugated outback roads for a long period of time, or harsh off-roading, particularly if you have a poorer quality shock.
A vehicle that feels spongy and bounces around a lot when driving can indicate bad shocks. If a shock is leaking, it also means a seal has failed. Shocks have liquid, gas, or both in them, and once a seal fails, the easiest way to fix them is to replace them, or if you have a rebuildable shock, to put a new seal kit through.
Another way you can check to see if your shocks have failed is to bounce the vehicle at each corner and then watch the vehicle recover. If it keeps bouncing, it means your shocks may need attention. Obviously, we've just replaced the shocks in the Pony, so they're good to go, but it's more so you get the idea.
To prevent early suspension failure, the best way is to ensure you fit the correct springs for the load you're carrying. That way, the suspension is designed to handle the weight, and it puts less stress on your driveline when you load it up. Common causes for failure in your gearbox are high kilometre vehicles, lack of maintenance, heavy towing in the wrong gear, such as labouring the vehicle towing a heavy trailer in 5th gear up a hill.
Another quick tip if you've got a manual is don't drive around with your hand resting on the gear stick. Doing that wears down the selector fork inside the gearbox, and over time, it'll be harder to shift into gear.
Grinding and crunching when going into gear can indicate bad synchronizers, and if the vehicle also jumps out of gear as well, that can also mean bad synchros or contaminated oil. Like with your diffs, draining your oil will give you a good indication of the condition of your gearbox as well.
One of the biggest killers of any automatic transmission is heat. That can usually come from something as simple as fitting bigger tyres to your vehicle, or towing a heavy load, or even something like not having a big enough transmission cooler. All of that puts excess stress on your automatic transmission. But to chat a little bit more about it, and to give us a couple of expert tips, here's our good mate Rocket Rod from Wholesale Automatic Transmissions, who's an absolute guru on everything autos.
Tips for making your automatic transmission last longer. Number 1. Service your automatic transmission regularly. Once every 2 years or 50,000 Ks is what we recommend, right? There is no such thing as a sealed automatic transmission. This simply means that they haven't used the filler tube and dipstick from factory. You still need to replace the oil pan gasket, the oil filter that's in there, let alone under-car inspections to make sure that the transmission's not leaking. So it's very important. You need to service your automatic transmission. Auxiliary oil cooler. We always recommend an auxiliary oil cooler for any vehicle, especially if they tow. It's not just about those people who believe that they're overheating the transmission. It's a gimme that they're going to need an oil cooler. But it's also about the difference, the longevity of the oil seals and the oil. We can get an extra 100 or 200,000 Ks out of an automatic transmission if we can keep the difference between how cold it is in the morning and what its normal running temperature is during the day. If you put an auxiliary cooler in and you can keep the difference between these two, then the cycle from hot to cold, which is what actually makes seals go brittle, is actually what makes the big difference, right? So add an auxiliary oil cooler, you'll be thankful for it. Right? Number 3, temp gauge. You need to look at the temp gauge. Now, no good having a light in there that tells you what went wrong, right? So we recommend an aftermarket temp gauge, and that can be a scan gauge or it can be a dedicated transmission temperature gauge is what we recommend here. We prefer a temperature gauge because it's easy to look at a glimpse, rather than on a scan gauge we're trying to look at a little number, and that's even if you have the transmission temperature up on the gauge. Now the transmission temp will teach you so much about the automatic transmission. You'll very quickly learn what she does and doesn't like, and actually in fact after a period of time you'll be able to pick when something's not right with the transmission. And not only that, you'll also be able to pick what you can do to get around when it's actually overheating, whether you're trying backing off a little bit or changing down a gear. You'll get used to, via a temp gauge, what works in your transmission.
The best way to ensure your engine lasts a long time is to do regular oil and filter changes. That will also let you inspect the oil regularly to keep an eye on it if anything's going on. For example, in my Hilux, I change the oil and filter every 5,000 Ks and the oil, filter and fuel filter every 10,000. One of the easiest ways to tell if your engine is sick is if it's blowing any smoke. A general rule of thumb is that bluish grey smoke is usually burning oil, which can range from valve stem seals to worn piston rings, which will allow oil into the combustion chamber. It also depends on when the smoke comes on.
For example, if you see a little bit of blue smoke and it comes on with a quick jab of the throttle, that can usually indicate something like worn valve stem seals in a petrol engine. But if you notice a fair bit of blue smoke under excessive load, for example, when you're accelerating up a long hill, that can usually indicate worn piston rings.
Although blowing smoke in diesels is much more common. White smoke is generally from a problem with combustion and fuel, and it can range from fuel not being burnt correctly to something like a poor spray pattern from an injector, to a turbo seal failure on a turbocharged vehicle, or even in extreme cases, coolant making its way into the combustion chamber due to head damage. And finally, black smoke is often excess fuel.
The other area that's critical to keep on top of with your engine is the cooling system. You can have the best engine in the world, but if you don't keep it cool, it's going to cause you dramas.
Also, your factory temp gauge may not move straight away if your temp goes up. But if you reckon your engine is running hot, first up, get the easy stuff out of the way by checking your radiator isn't blocked with mud. After taking the vehicle for a drive, before you turn it off, pop the bonnet and keep an eye on the engine fan. Shut the engine off and check to see if the fan keeps spinning like this. If it does, that can indicate a worn viscous hub, which means your fan won't be pulling air through the radiator as much as it should be.
Another handy tip is to actually check your radiator cap. It's something that's pretty often overlooked, but if these fail, it can actually cause your whole cooling system to overheat. So when you do check them, check that the spring operates correctly and it is holding pressure in the system. That said though, if you are doing a cooling system service, it's a smart idea just to chuck a new one of these on. They don't cost a lot and they're often overlooked. Well, I'll tell you what, I reckon if there's been a general theme of this video, it's that the more you modify your vehicle with bigger tyres and bigger suspension lifts, the faster mechanical components are going to wear down. Having said that though, that's not to say you can't go and put bigger tyres and a bigger suspension lift on your vehicle. After all, we do that to our four-wheel drive so we can get out on the tracks and explore and have fun. As long as you understand that by doing that, the components in your vehicle are going to wear down faster, so you need to be aware of it and make sure you keep on top of maintenance. And if you do that, you'll have a reliable four-wheel drive that will last for years to come. Also, if you have any other mechanical tips that you've picked up after working on your own four-wheel drive, chuck them in the comments below and we'll be sure to check them out. Check out our Facebook and Instagram page as well if you haven't already to see what the boys and I are getting up to over the next couple of trips. Other than that, thanks so much for watching and I'll see you next time. Another thing that's really important to keep an eye on is your radiator cap. And to demonstrate, no, I'm just kidding, that's too many screwdrivers.